strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. On the talking point this week, we are looking at 3 summits that Xi Jinping has held in Riyadh with Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad. Good evening to all our viewers who are watching this live, and a warm welcome to those viewers who will pick up this stream later on our YouTube channel. As we said, we have Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad with us. He's been India's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, and to Oman. And he's also, his latest book, which came out this year, is, of course, West Asia at War, Repression, Resistance, and the Great Power Games. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
First of all, just looking at this comprehensive strategic partnership that has been signed, there's an MOU with Huawei. That's just one of, I think, 34 deals, reportedly worth $30 billion. Both sides clearly see a lot of gain in deepening ties.
I view the visit of President Xi Jinping as marking the culmination of significant changes that have been taking place in West Asia over the last few years. Most of these countries were very deeply tied with the Americans as far as their security, economic and defense interests were concerned. And we have observed for a certain period of time that this engagement with the Americans is now corroding. America as losing itself is indicated a sense of disenchantment with the region, and the region itself has lost a lot, sees the Americans as much less credible a partner as far as the region is concerned. Obviously, they are looking at a scenario where they can diversify their relationships and build up what we would now call a multi-alignment scenario of relationships with several people. I think this particular visit marks a very firm assertion of these important changes that have been taking place in the regional order.
Sure. Again, talking about these deals, though, very little is known about the Huawei deal. It will naturally raise U.S. hackles. You were talking about how the U.S. has been present in the region quite some, both strategically in military terms as well. It will raise hackles, especially because some would say that it possibly gives a backdoor entry to the Chinese to other American technologies, whether it's defense equipment that the Saudis have.
I find the Americans quite unable to understand the significant changes that are taking place right before their eyes. Very often their spokespersons make statements that reveal a certain mindset that belongs to another era. This looking at the world in black and white terms, as looking at either you are my friend or you are my enemy, and being a friend means you have to support everything that I believe in. I think all that is now past its use by date. The world has moved on. Today there are countries, even middle powers, that are asserting a role for themselves in world affairs in support of their own interests. Very often the Americans got a free ride in West Asia earlier, where they used to demand that the rest of the region support what they were doing, even when it harmed the region's interests. Recall over here the long sanctions inspections regime and no-fly zones in Iraq, and then of course the assault upon Iraq in 2003. All of these damaged the region's stability, but at that time the region supported the Americans. Not so anymore. I would argue to you that the principal countries in the region are today witnessing a coming of age. They are the guardians of their own interests, and they will pursue diplomatic efforts in support of their interests, quite independent of any American posture in that regard. So I think this is where I would see the Americans. They are now insisting that if you are my ally, you will not have technology deals with the Chinese or anyone else. But that is an absurd demand. Each country has a right to decide how it would like to manage its own future, including its technological future. So I think that these kind of remarks that the Americans make serve very little useful purpose. They are an irritant, and I think the region will shrug them off.
But is that because of the way the Americans treat their allies, their partners, their people who are there in their coalition, in terms of, like you're saying, giving them demands? Because there may be actual security concerns with Chinese technology.
I would say to you, the Americans have not understood the meaning of the word ally or friend. As far as they are concerned, they are unique and exceptional, and that they are doing a favor to other countries if they befriend them. The other countries are deemed to be friends to the extent they support American interests and American point of view. I had once used the term that American relationships are like the subsidiary alliance that Wellesley had introduced, where you had all these princes in India bound to the empire through a subsidiary alliance, an alliance, but it ensured that you were a subordinate part of the alliance, not an equal partner. And I think that is where it has gone, and that is where today most countries in the world have moved on. Isn't it astonishing that outside Europe, the Americans have hardly any support in terms of the sanctions they have imposed upon Russia? Not even, no West Asian countries backing them, not even the Israelis are supportive of them. So countries have indicated very clearly that, look, you are not going to dictate to us. We are not your enemies, but we reserve the right to build friendships and alignments of our choice on the basis of our understanding of our interests.
Sure. Just a reminder to our viewers, if you like this video, do press the thumbs up next to the YouTube descriptor and share this link with your friends, colleagues, and family. Ambassador, since you're talking about the Americans in the region, especially Saudi Arabia, there's been a strain in the bilateral relations between them, though, of course, would you agree that security would remain a key leg? I mean, there has been Khashoggi, there's been warning of consequences for not increasing oil production. Biden, as we saw those pictures just now, got a very different welcome to Xi as well. And before you answer that, Ambassador, I just want to add to that a question from one of our viewers, Jaydeep Gadavi, who says, American thinkers believe that China is pretty happy with Americans handling security and the Chinese handling business in West Asia. Do you expect major security agreements between China and West Asian countries?
I don't think that you should put a firewall between security on the one hand and business on the other. When we speak of a strategic partnership, it embraces very substantial energy and economic cooperation as well. A logistical connectivity project has a certain strategic value as well. What China is doing at present is not to be a direct role player and a security guarantor in the region, like the Americans had projected themselves to be. China does not wish to get into this aspect. But what I find is, and this is an important consideration for the Americans, that the region does not see itself in a security vacuum. What Biden wrote on the eve of his visit to Saudi Arabia in July, that I will not allow a vacuum to emerge that will be filled in by the Chinese, the Russians and Iran, has completely misunderstood the region. The region does not believe there is a security vacuum. My own sense is that the region has come of age and is fully confident with regard to safeguarding its own interests. And they are pursuing these interests on the basis of diplomatic engagements. So I think that you need to really update thinking in Washington, D.C. in this regard. It doesn't, just because the Chinese are not talking about security in the military sense, they are concerned about stability. If you want to have a successful economic cooperation, and many of their actions have in fact deepened insecurity all across the region and have damaged the region, killed several 100,000 people, and have destroyed societies and communities, but have not done anything constructive for the region as far as I can recall.
Sure. I mean, and again, just keeping with the US Saudi partnership, just yesterday, I think it was, the Russia-U.S. prisoner swap of NBA star Brittney Griner with convicted arms dealer Viktor Bout. Now, the Saudis and the UAE official statements claim mediation by MbS and MBZ. The US making it a point to say that no third country was involved apart from the territory of the UAE being used, that is, just being facilitators.
Well, there seems to be some confusion about what is meant by different sides. The substantive dialogue with regard to the swap of the two people, the American and the Russian, was very clearly done by the Americans with the Russians. But the actual implementation of this swap arrangement was handled by Saudi Arabia and by the UAE. I believe both aspects are important. Both the agreement in principle to conduct the swap and the actual implementation of the swap. I think it would have been a little gracious on the part of the American to pay sufficient tribute to the role that was played by the kingdom and by the UAE. But I think the American role has become a little churlish. They are unhappy about several things happening in the region, and therefore they are sulking rather than being the mature state they ought to be.
When you say that there should be no firewall between the defense and economic part of a strategic comprehensive partnership, there have been a lot of reports of Chinese drone production in Saudi Arabia, some reports going back to a couple of years when they talked about Chinese ballistic missile technology being provided to the Saudis.
Yes. I'm not sure that in the near future or even in the medium term, the region, West Asia, will stop buying American weaponry. It will not. What will happen is there will be a diversification in regard to the purchases. And this diversification will be based on objective considerations. In the past, many times it was felt that Gulf countries are buying American weaponry in order to solidify the strategic partnership because they knew and they understood well that in the United States, the arms lobby is a very powerful lobby and is a very important factor in ensuring good relationship. And it worked. But today you find as this region has become more self-confident and I have said come of age effectively, you do see them now deciding to buy weaponry of the kind they actually need and setting up defense arrangements with various countries. For example, both the UAE and Saudi Arabia have announced that they want to be major defense production hubs in the region, and they are looking for partners in this regard. You may recall in this context that when Prime Minister Modi went to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE, both of them suggested that Indian companies could be participants as well in setting up production units. What we know in the public domain is that there is a Chinese factory to manufacture drones. Now, the CNN has referred to ballistic missiles. Very often drones are confused with missiles. So I don't know whether there are a separate missile facility, or is the CNN referring to the drones. What we have read is that there is a drones facility. But the kingdom has announced a very ambitious program to expand its domestic defense production. This will take a long time, but they have got certain milestones in this regard. I think over a certain period of time, they want to reach 50% self-sufficiency. Let us see the situation. I would reassert that they are not going to cut defense ties with the Americans. The Americans will remain defense suppliers, but it does not mean there will not be others as well from Europe, Russia, and China as well.
Again, a reminder to our viewers, at the bottom of your screen, there's a scroll. You can join our Telegram circle, which will give you updates on what we put up as soon as we do that on our website and our YouTube channel. A couple of questions from viewers, Ambassador. One from Varun Pratap, who says, "Good evening, Ambassador. What are the possibilities of Saudi Arabia joining BRICS?"
Yes. There is already information in this regard. China has mentioned the possibility of a BRICS plus. I think the BRICS has shown its own significance. It is an important gathering outside the Western alignment. It is a very major initiative by countries from the South, broadly developing countries, and I do think a time has come for it to look at additional partners who will bring value to the relationship and to the coalition. I am not sure to what extent there have been serious discussions in this regard, but I would imagine that Saudi Arabia is a very major candidate, and I think it will bring extraordinary value to the grouping.
Also, Ambassador, your comments on MbS's Neom Vision 2030 and China's BRI and how they kind of dovetail into each other for both the countries. I mean, there's been a lot of reporting about how the BRI is
Yes.
sagging, especially the CPEC, etc.
See, Vision 2030 is a flagship project as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned. It aims at fundamentally transforming the kingdom's economic foundations and preparing the country for a post-oil scenario. It's a very visionary document. It calls for an all-round revamping of the existing economic order in the country. The Belt and Road Initiative from the Chinese side is also a significant flagship project. It is the most significant instrument for the spread of Chinese economic cooperation right across Eurasia, and has garnered support from 120 or 130 countries. It has also made significant progress in implementing several projects. Initially, when President Xi Jinping had announced Belt and Road Initiative, when it was called OBOR, the Gulf countries were not part of it except for Iran, because there was a sense of conflict and turmoil at that time. We had the emergence, the war in Syria, the emergence of the Islamic State, and the conflict in Yemen, and the confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But since then, China has made a major effort to ensure that the GCC countries also become partners in the Belt and Road Initiative, and the GCC have responded very positively. As far as UAE is concerned, it sees itself as a global leader as far as infrastructure is concerned. So it is an investor, a consultant, a contractor, and a user. And the similar perspective obtains in Saudi Arabia as well. Do recall, all these Gulf countries have infrastructure far superior to anything that you have in the West today. And China is a major developer as far as infrastructure is concerned. So there is a very natural synergy as far as the implementation of Belt and Road is concerned. And all these countries have today enthusiastically come on board and are participating in the Belt and Road. So there is, as far as the Saudi Vision 2030 is concerned, it also consists of mega projects. The total Neom project, for example, is valued at about $1 trillion. So China sees itself as an important partner in the development of infrastructure all across this region, whether you're talking about roads or railways or digitalizing different transport facilities. China has been a presence here for about 15 years, and it sees itself as now participating in these mega projects which are mentioned in the joint statement as well. And I think that this is something, there is a sense that China's presence in the development of the regional infrastructure, in its modernization into the 21st century based on technology, is something that both sides would welcome for mutual benefit.
Another question, since we're talking about Saudi Arabia and China, what the Chinese trade is the maximum, and the Saudis are the largest exporter of oil to China. Kiran K asks, will there be an agreement to supply oil to China in case of war with Taiwan? Are those kind of things built into these agreements?
Let me emphasize one point to our interlocutor. Taiwan is a non-issue, and there is no intention on the part of Beijing or the Taiwanese government to ever engage in conflict. It is a coincidence that the Americans have deliberately and self-consciously heightened tensions relating to Taiwan and have allowed certain sections of the Taiwanese administration to make remarks which would be deemed to be provocative in Beijing. But I think that today there is no prospect of war on this subject. Let us be also very clear. Taiwan is not a sovereign country. Taiwan is an integral part of China, and the One China policy is the foundation of foreign policy of all the countries in the world, including the United States. So let's not get carried away by American rhetoric. It is very misleading. And I saw this whole heightening of tension relating to Taiwan as on line with what the Americans engineered in regard to Ukraine, provoking the Russians by expanding NATO further and further east and trying to indicate that for them the Cold War was not over. I'm not sure that Taiwan is going the same way. There is a lot of wisdom in China in this regard. In fact, Taiwan and China are very significant economic partners as well. Where it comes to supply, if you read the joint statement as also the position of Saudi Arabia is very clear, and it is reiterated in the joint statement that they believe in One China and they do not believe in any of these provocations connected with Taiwan. Therefore, I don't believe that there is any scenario where the supplies of oil to China would be jeopardized from the Gulf countries, from Saudi Arabia specifically.
Let's come to India, Ambassador, in the region, and specifically, I mean, I think late November, there was talk by the Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal. There were meetings as well. After Australia and the UAE, in terms of comprehensive economic treaties, India is also pursuing one with the GCC.
India's ties with the GCC are historic in character. While the Chinese have entered the region relatively recently, just a few years ago, India has been a presence in the region from the time of the Indus Valley civilization. And this relationship has remained unbroken throughout this. And we are a valued partner for every country in the region, as exemplified by the presence of our community in the region, 8.5 million strong, and the warm welcome that our leaders have received in the region consistently over the last 30 years, most recently during the visits of Prime Minister Modi. I do not see this scenario in terms of zero sum. If China is, I would not accept that if China's ties with the region are expanding, it is at India's expense, or if India's ties expand, it is at China's expense. I don't believe that zero-sum scenario. Each country brings to relationships its own importance, its own value. As far as India is concerned, it is a very major buyer of oil from the region. It is also a very major economic partner. It's a trade partner. It is also a major destination for investments from the region. Many of our companies are working in the region and executing major high value projects. And the most significant aspect is the confidence in our community. We have 8.5 million people living in the region, and we are the majority community in 3 countries. What more can you ask in terms of mutual confidence? And therefore, I would say that India's interests, India has its own dialogue with the region. India has its own platforms for regular engagement. You know, in the case of Saudi Arabia, we have set up a dialogue platform at summit level, Prime Minister and the Crown Prince. We also have platforms for dialogue between the National Security Advisor and the Foreign Minister, and we have a very robust joint commission as well. So I'm not sure that India is being elbowed out of the region only because of one visit by President Xi Jinping. So, but at the same time, I would suggest the following, that India should remain focused on the region. The kind of enthusiasm that accompanied Prime Minister Modi's initial forays into the region between 2015 and 2017, that tempo needs to be pursued, that it needs to be carried forward. We need to constantly ensure that there is substance to the relationship beyond rhetoric. Very often we are accused by making very substantial statements and not following it up with specific proposals or specific projects. And I would say that this is something that can hold us back. Also, I would say that certain developments within India, which are a part of our domestic politics, sometimes bleed into the region and create misunderstandings. You know, most recently the remarks relating to the Holy Prophet, and earlier the demonization of Muslims in 2020 in the context of the COVID, these were ill received in the region. And the region, while it's very anxious to have major ties and is not concerned with what is happening in the domestic scenario in India, it would not like to be a witness to certain of these developments that cause disquiet within their community at home. I have warned, for example, that we have, I don't want anything to happen that could harm the recruitment of Indians. You know, recruitment is not done by governments. Recruitment is done by individual employers. And the last thing an employer would want is to have on his payroll certain people who could create discord within the workforce. So we are there in strength for all these years because our people have been apolitical, because we have not, and we are a country that has espoused democracy and secularism. That is our strength, and it is on this basis that you find such an expansion of our presence in every country of the GCC. Therefore, I would suggest we should build on our strength rather than corrode it.
Sure. So you rated India's foreign policy. We also said that China coming into the region, or not just because of this visit, but over the last few years, is not a zero-sum game. But a question relating to policy in the Gulf, Ambassador, find it, yeah. Kiran G asked, what about Qatar's foreign policy on India? I guess they're referring to, in fact, those ex-naval personnel who are held there for
no
over
country
8 months.
in the Gulf has a foreign policy that is hostile to India. So these kind of loose remarks serve no useful purpose. There are blips from time to time with regard to certain specific events. We do not have, as far as Qatar's present situation is concerned, relating to the 8 Navy personnel who are retired, we do not have the full facts available to us. Until I have full facts, I'm not going to comment on it. Obviously, there must have been a certain fairly serious concern experienced in Doha if they took such a major set of actions in order to apprehend and detain our personnel. It is something quite unprecedented. But as I said, we do not have information. Until we have information, let us not jump into any conclusion. As far as loose remarks relating to any country's foreign policy, let us be very clear. Every country in the region attaches the highest possible importance to its relationship with India and looks up to India with a high degree of respect. Each of them has a strategic partnership with India whose content varies with the country concerned. And we had a strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia as long ago as February 2010. And the Riyadh Declaration spoke about cooperation in security, intelligence, defense, political, economic, and cultural. So let us not get carried away by individual events. We do not know enough information about it, but I can assure my interlocutor, no Gulf country acts in haste. No Gulf country has any hostility towards India. On the contrary, they have the greatest possible goodwill and affection for our country and for our people.
Another one from Puneet Ambassador. He's talking about your book, and we just had the blurb of your book up there. He's talking about I2U2 and what is your view on that and what you said in the book.
I wrote that just a few months ago, and no development has occurred which would suggest to me that the scenario objective, my own views have remained the same. I have no reason to change those views. The reason is this. What is I2U2 other than a glib abbreviation, a clever abbreviation? What is it that brings those countries together? Is there a shared security concern? Is there a shared strategic perspective? There are three of them, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel and the United States are already in a kind of relationship with each other. What is the additionality that India has brought to the region? At one time, people had talked about each of them has a very different perspective as far as regional security is concerned. As far as economic cooperation is concerned, you don't need I2U2. Economic cooperation is pursued by companies, and companies know where their interests lie. Why do you need to call something I2U2 in order to promote cooperation? Therefore, I used the term in my book, it's a theater as an end in itself. It serves no useful purpose. I stand by that. I'm not saying that theater has no value in international affairs, but let us not exaggerate its importance, and let us not be taken in by rhetoric as opposed to substance.
You talked earlier about the joint statement, the Saudi-Chinese joint statement, Ambassador, where it specifically said one of the key points was not to interfere in each other's internal affairs. In lieu of that, there's a question from Krishan Verma who says, what about the Uyghur Muslims?
I have stated earlier, the Gulf countries do not make comments about internal developments with other countries, and they expect the same reciprocity as far as their own situation is concerned. To the best of my knowledge, no Gulf country, no GCC countries has ever criticized China's treatment of its Uyghur community. This is seen as a domestic situation, and it is to be handled by the Chinese in their wisdom. There is a very clear reference in this regard in the joint statement where the Saudi side criticizes countries which interfere in China's domestic affairs on the pretext of human rights. I think this is a reference directly to matters relating to the Uyghur community, and I think the Saudis have made very clear their policy that they don't have any view that would be critical of the Chinese in this regard.
Iran is also something that one of the countries that found a mention in the joint statement, Ambassador. Yeah. Your thoughts on Iran and the region in lieu of what Chakravarti Bedi asked, what happened to the $400 billion deal that China announced with Iran under the BRI banner? Is the PRC playing both sides in West Asia?
Let me clarify. The Chinese don't see sides. Their approach to the region is to have good ties with every country in the region. They are not hostile. They do not take sides in regional disputes. And therefore, it's not a question of playing one side against the other. The agreement that China entered into with Iran is, as far as the published document is concerned, it is stated in very general terms. It is a 25-year agreement of cooperation that has political, defense, security, economic and energy components. This figure of $400 billion or even $200 billion is not mentioned in the document available in the public domain. Nor is there any mention in that document about the presence of Chinese armed forces on certain areas or the location of Chinese troops to defend various facilities, etc. There was a lot of noise at that time possibly came from informal sources at a time in 2021 when both China and Iran were facing a lot of heat from the Americans. And they were signaling at that time to the international community, particularly to the Americans, that they have very substantial alternatives available and that they will turn to each other and support each other. What shape or form this relationship takes in the future, we will see. It is there in front of us. Iran is a very significant partner in the Belt and Road Initiative. Recall here, about 3 or 4 years ago, a train from Xi'an came to Tehran with goods, and from Tehran it went across to Europe, to Madrid, and 2 or 3 weeks later this same train came back to Tehran, and from Tehran it went to Xi'an. So connectivity projects are already being implemented all across the region in a multimodal format. So there is a substantial relationship which is between Iran and China already. Second point I want to mention is, as part of the diplomatic churn and what I have referred to as coming of age, the region itself has taken in diplomatic initiatives to address issues that divide them. For example, 5 rounds of dialogue have taken place between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They have taken place at the level of intelligence officers. Obviously, 5 rounds have taken place. There has been a very substantial exchange of views with regard to issues that divide them. And I would imagine that the issues that divide them relate to Yemen as well as Syria and the bilateral scenario. I think these are very thorny issues. And I
the
think
nuclear
that
issue?
nuclear issue has never been an issue in the Gulf. It is an issue which has been agitated by Israel and used by the Americans to impose sanctions. The concerns that the region has had has been about Iran's activities in the region if the sanctions were diluted. They have looked at the sanctions as a way of keeping this huge giant country under control. I lived in Saudi Arabia for 10 years. I have never heard a Saudi speak that he has concerns about nuclear weapons from Iran. He has concerns about a security threat from Iran, also concerns relating to the mobilization of the minority Shia communities in different places against the state order, but never about the nuclear issue. Much of this nuclear issue, the information relating to Iran's so-called nuclear program, has come from Israel. Very dubious sources, constantly proven wrong, but they feed into the xenophobia in the United States, particularly in the Republican Party, and have ensured that for the 40 years at least, and nuclear related sanctions for the last 20 years have remained in place and have continued to be crippling. As you know, Iran is also not a foreign policy issue in the United States. It's a matter of domestic politics, as it is in the case of Iran. Domestic politics influences in several ways the US approach to Iran and Iran's approach to the US. My own view is that the divide between these two countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, has not been a consistent pattern. Before the Islamic Revolution, indeed, they were partners with the United States in the Cold War. Even afterwards, after the Iran-Iraq war, you had Rafsanjani visiting Saudi Arabia and building up fairly substantial ties between the two countries. And I remember that Crown Prince Abdullah bin Abdulaziz welcomed President Rafsanjani by recalling that they were major Islamic countries which have had a civilizational connectivity going back several centuries. He never spoke about the sectarian divide. The sectarian divide was deliberately constructed in Saudi Arabia when the threat of the Arab Spring had occurred. So it mobilized support domestically and regionally against the agitations of the Arab Spring by creating the bogey of a sectarian threat from Iran. And I think that today, when they are talking to each other, I think they will, one of the issues which will take the relationship forward will be the decision of the two countries not to raise the sectarian issue and use it as an instrument for divisions all across the region.
Just end with another viewer question. I mean, in terms of petrodollars, in terms of the dollar being the currency of the world, again, Jaydeep, who's asking, would you care to comment on the yuan corridor being established between China, Pakistan, Russia, and Iran? And more specifically, there has been some kind of reports on Saudi Arabia and China dealing with oil in yuan.
I know that China is anxious for its currency to become a global currency, a currency that is used for major international transactions. And there are frequent published reports that indicate that one of the things that they would like to do is to see oil exports from the region, particularly from Saudi Arabia, being denominated in yuan. The Saudis have not responded positively in this regard. Do recall here that for at least 4 decades, all the currencies of Gulf countries are fixed in value with the dollar. Therefore, as the dollar goes up and down, their own currencies go up and down. This relationship has not been diluted in any way. Does the world need other alternative currencies? Possibly it does. But it is not happening just yet. As far as I can see, the dollar remains the currency for international transactions, including for energy transactions. Why is there disquiet in this regard? And that is because of US sanctions against Iran and then on Russia. And particularly the instrument used by the Americans was to deny banking facilities for all transactions in dollars. So immediately the countries concerned start looking for alternative routes. So between Russia and China, I understand that there has been an expansion in yuan trade between the two countries. Russia also, with regard to Iran, there have been alternative means adopted to bypass the sanctions that the Americans have imposed. There is also a search in the international community for alternative routes for international transactions beyond SWIFT, which are US controlled, though not located in the US controlled, which are used as an instrument of coercion. Very often the whole sanctions regime against Iran, which has been seen as extremely onerous, and which is not just a bilateral sanction of the Americans, but is a set of sanctions imposed all over the international community. That means US's enemies have to become the world's enemies, and this is proving to be very onerous. For example, we were forced to deny ourselves any import of Iranian oil by the Trump regime, a thoroughly discredited regime, discredited in its own country and discredited the world over. These are the factors. A high level of irresponsibility on the part of Washington DC imposing its own diktat all over the world, that is what is causing a lot of countries to think of alternative views. It is not something that the dollar is not, status of the dollar is not cast in stone. I am confident that the international community will come up with various alternatives in order to protect their long-term interests as far as US sanctions are concerned.
Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, again, absolutely appreciate you giving us so much time on StratNews Global.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
The pleasure was ours. Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad speaking there, and I can see a lot of chatter on the live YouTube box on his comments. But if you do need instant updates that we put up both on our website and YouTube channel, you can see the scroll at the bottom of your screen to join our Telegram circle. You can also help support us. There's a UPI QR code link in the YouTube description, and it's also flashing on your screen. This is The Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. ठीक है